Whether security tightened around the home of the former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. The authorities there fear that Bolsonaro is a flight risk ahead of his treason trial. And there is, of course, also outrage still bubbling under about Donald Trump threatening Brazil with sanctions if the case against the man seen as his political admirer is not dropped.
President Lula announces to Cabinet the American decision to revoke the Justice Minister's US visa. It might not have an impact as wide as the 50% tariff levelled against Brazil at the end of July, but the message is just as clear, and so too was Lula's response.
If we liked emperors, Brazil would still be a monarchy. We don't want that anymore. We want this country to be democratic and sovereign, a republic, which is what we've learned to build.
Trying to form a leader was never going to be easy, and President Lula went on to accuse Jair Bolsonaro's son, based in the US, of lobbying the Trump administration, and in so doing, betraying Brazil. On the same day, Supreme Court judge overseeing the coup attempt trial, Alexandre de Moraes, ordered around-the-clock monitoring of the former president, already under house arrest due to flight risk. And at least one other judge on the Supreme Court has come out in vocal support of his colleague's stance.
I consider the work carried out by Alexandre de Moraes to be extremely important, even historic, and I fully support his work and his performance.
The defendant is facing up to 40 years in prison if convicted of plotting to hold on to power after losing the 2022 elections.
It is a remarkable situation, those images that we saw ending the report by Daniel Quinlan, really illustrating what happened when Jair Bolsonaro refused to accept defeat in the presidential election, and of course his supporters storming the seat of power in Brasilia. Let's bring in for more analysis Richard Lapper. Richard is from the Chatham House think tank. He is also author of a book, and we'll show you the cover of that book, Beef, Bible and Bullets. Richard, continue the title of your book, please. Beef, Bible and Bullets and?
Well, Brazil in the age of Bolsonaro is the subtitle, although I think the age of Bolsonaro is coming to an end, as your report has indicated.
It indicates that you are the right person at the right time to have to talk about this story. And thank you, sir, for joining us here on France 24. We appreciate your time. What do you make of this situation, then, where we have Bolsonaro being supported by Donald Trump so overtly, it seems, in the sense that Trump would even threaten tariffs against Brazil if the case isn't dropped?
Yeah, I mean, the tariffs that Trump introduced, the Trump administration introduced in mid-July and finally put into place in August, have really racked up tension between Brazil and the United States. Bolsonaro is facing trial, which will begin next week, on the grounds, as your report's already suggested, in fact, on the grounds of him planning, along with his associates, a military coup to kill Lula and the Deputy President Geraldo Alckmin and the main Chief Justice Alexandre de Moraes back in December 2022. And these are no trumped-up charges. The federal police have an 800-page dossier detailing the plot. It ended in 2003 in a whimper when the supporters of Bolsonaro invaded Congress, much as supporters of Donald Trump himself had invaded the Congress buildings in the United States back in 2020 when he lost that election. So there's a case against Bolsonaro, and Trump basically has said that unless that case is dropped, these sanctions will be imposed on Brazil. Fortunately for President Lula, this has turned out to be something of an own goal, since Brazil's not that dependent on the United States. Its economy won't be that heavily affected by the 50% tariff. And in fact, the main effect of this measure is to increase Lula's popularity. You know, over the last 2 months, Lula's, as you see there on the images, has been rejuvenated. He's 80 in October. He has a chance to fight a fourth election in October next year. And at the moment, he's looking good for a potential re-election.
Isn't the main asset, the main weapon that Lula has in this big discussion, is that he was elected fairly? Am I right in presuming that the election, as it took place, there was no great suspicion of widespread fraud? There was no great suspicion that anything had been fixed. Lula was elected fairly and squarely, but Bolsonaro would not accept losing.
I mean, I don't think. I mean, there's lots wrongs with the Brazilian political system, but I think the electoral system itself is generally regarded as being quite fair. It's an electronic system, and I don't think, Bolsonaro, before he criticized and complained about fraud in 2022 when Lula won, he'd been elected successive congressional elections. He was elected in 2018 as president by this same system. So it rings fairly hollow, to be frank.
So that's another parallel with Donald Trump then, and Bolsonaro.
There's definitely a parallel with Donald Trump. I mean, it's a deliberate parallel as far as Bolsonaro is concerned. He's described Donald Trump as his idol, a political idol, and in many ways, the sort of right-wing populism that Trump represents, Bolsonaro represents in its Brazilian version. Good support for Bolsonaro from evangelical Christians, a lobby that's growing quite quickly in Brazil, about 25% of the population, from the agricultural sector, who don't like environmental regulation, and from hardline policemen who want to take a tougher line against organized crime.
So clearly, Trump, having waived the threat of these tariffs, the effect of that on Brazil, you were talking about a little bit earlier. Can I go back to that and ask about the effect on Brazil's business, on the economy, and of course the trickle-down effect? Because if we talk about trickle-down, and usually we say trickle-down economics, what we do see is that poorer people get a worse deal.
Well, look, I mean, Brazil exports about 11% of its export revenue come from the United States. It's by way more dependent these days on China and other markets in what we call the global South. But 30% of its export revenue comes from China. So the macroeconomic impact of and these tariffs, in fact, will only affect about half those US exports, because the US realized that it will be harder hit than Brazil by the tariffs. Actually, Brazil has a trade deficit with the United States. The US has a trade surplus with Brazil. So Brazil's dependency on the US is very limited. In one or two sectors, however, there is an impact in coffee, in orange juice, in some manufacturing sectors, and jobs will be lost in those sectors. The government in Brazil is doing quite a lot to try to offset that impact in particular cases with subsidies and easy credit for those affected. But I think that there will be an impact, but it won't be that great.
Interesting, and as you've already said, it seems like quite an own goal for Donald Trump to have scored. In terms of Jair Bolsonaro, clearly a man who stands for certain things, and some people like it and some people don't. But in terms of going through the legal process now, in terms of what could happen to him, what's your sense of how it will go?
I think most people looking at this now think that it's very likely, very probable, I would say, that Bolsonaro will be sentenced to a long prison term. Now, that people are talking in the latest commentary 30, 40 years potentially. These are very serious charges, of course. But now, whether once having been committed to a prison term, Bolsonaro stays in prison beyond that, is for that period is another matter. It's the right wing in Brazil, not necessarily those really loyal to Bolsonaro, but the right wing conservative interests in general are still very strong. And although Lula is likely to win next year's election, I think at this point, it's not inevitable. It's possible that a right-wing government could come in 2026 or in 2030 and essentially quash the charges.
So justice is very much a political game in Brazil.
It is, I mean, I think it is a political game, but the judiciary in Brazil is, although it's subject to political influence, we're not talking about the rather crass manipulation of the judiciary that takes place in countries such as Venezuela or Bolivia, where the judiciary really have no independent existence. The institutions in Brazil are pretty strong, and they're not without their defects, but Brazil's a much more serious country.
Richard Lapper, we'll leave it there, but thank you so much for the insight you provided us. And I'll say once again that you are author of the book Beef, Bible and Bullets, Brazil in the Age of Bolsonaro, which you say is an age which is coming to a close with this trial which is going ahead. But of course, from the insight you've given us, we know that there are many interesting potential chapters ahead, some of which you may well write, Richard. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Richard Lapper from Chatham House. Thank you, sir, very much indeed. Pleasure to see you.